Well, this is the last of the workshops here. This is it. They saved the worst for last, and I just came from the awfulest jam that ever was, right over across the way there. It was wonderful. Played a lot of old fiddle tunes as fast as we could play them, and it was a good time. And so here I am with whoever managed to stick around this late in the workshops for this. And it's been cold, gray day. Saw a bit of snow coming down, but the warmth of the Hyman Settlement School, is something that, it's like being by a comfortable fire. Speaking of fires, I'm right in front of the fireplace. I was here one time for Christmas as Santa Claus. It was great. Everybody in the community used to come to the settlement school for Christmas, and I was staying down below, and all the toys were down there. There must have been 500 toys that I got to play with for months, before they got wrapped up for Christmas. And it was a good time at the Hyman Settlement School. We've got one more concert coming up tonight. Please come back for that. There'll be a few folks here live in the audience, but anybody's more than welcome to tune in that's been watching the workshops. 7 o'clock concert, and opportunity to hear a wide range of styles. And we're going to look at a broad swath of dulcimer styles and dulcimer builders now. So part of what I'd like to do is just spin a few yarns, talk about some of the people, places, and music, and stretching back into antiquity and coming up to more or less the present, with a focus on Kentucky in some of this, because Hyman has been a real hearth here on by the far side, and it was the hearth for quite a few dulcimer makers. McKinley Craft, Uncle Ed Thomas, whom you've heard of many a time here, Jethro Amburgey, Will Singleton, who was kin to Jean Ritchie through her mama's side, the Hall family, and they all made dulcimers, made some really interesting dulcimers here, and sold them out all over the world. And Jethro Amburgey, of course, was very important at the Hyman Settlement School, spreading them outwards. So I'm going to just sit by the fireplace here and talk. You're going to be watching, for the most part, a PowerPoint presentation now, and I'm going to be talking to my friend Mikey Sloan here and signaling at him a lot to get him to move things, since I don't have control of the computer. If any of us ever control the computer, that's a good question, an open question. So Mikey, maybe next slide. So here we are, all the way back to the beginnings of the dulcimer. Oh, and there's Don Petty pictured in here with the Flemish masters holding on to that dulcimer. I don't know where that came from. Old Flemish picture. Probably Rembrandt was responsible for that.
No, that's Wilfred.
No, I think I photoshopped you in that one. Yeah, but maybe it's Wilfred.
I don't know.
It's pretty good.
Yeah. And here we are. It's hard to say where that first instrument was like it, but I got one pictured in Germany in the 13th century. This is the 1200s, but it goes back even further than that. Next slide, please. Yeah, there it is, the monochord. Pythagoras, who was a mathematician and scientist in early Greece, used the monochord, and I built one of these once upon a time. It's just a sound box with a string on it, and he used it to figure out how sound worked, sound waves worked. And he figured if you touch it in the middle, you got and sound exactly twice as many waves per second. Well, that's a fancy way of saying an octave there. He figured that out, and he figured out the whole relationship of scales with this monochord, and that's really kind of the earliest form of the dulcimer that we have, I think. Okay. Well, the Scheitholt and that was depicted by Michael Praetorius, who was a very well-known choral music composer of the Renaissance, and he put together an encyclopedia of musical instruments, the Syntagma Musicus, in which there is a picture of the Scheithold there and a description of that instrument. And there it is as it was pictured, 1619. Next slide. And this is his description of it, and it's worth taking a few seconds to go through that. Although this instrument should rightly be referenced among the other worthless instruments, I still wish to describe it here since it's little known. And it's not unlike a shite or piece of wood, since it's almost like a small monocordium, and that's what I was talking about with Pythagoras, rather than simply built from 3 or 4 thin boards at the top, with a small collar with 3 or 4 pegs, strung with 3 or 4 strings of brass. And so, as you look at that description, it really is pretty close to what we have today in the Scheithold, and it's a little process, not too many steps to get from the Scheithold to the dulcimer. Next slide. So here's the timeline I'm going to take a look at with you all here from the ancient antecedents of the medieval era, Pythagoras, into the 19th century, what they call the pre-revival kind of families, the Ed Thomas, the Pritchard, and the Melton styles of dulcimers. The Kentucky revival, we usually, mark that, I guess, with Jethro Amburgey and that generation of players and craftsmen. John Jacob Niles is an interesting case, and we'll take a look at him in particular. I referenced the title to this, Dulcimers and Nilesimers. And that was Jean Ritchie's term, for, with her tongue in her cheek, for what John Jacob Niles was calling dulcimers. He started out learning from the Ritchie family in some part, but he started creating instruments that were modeled on the dulcimer. The way he played it was very different, that led us to really modern chording. Interesting way of looking at it. Homer Ledford was a neighbor of mine in Clark County, a person who was very, very important to the director of Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company, who just walked in the door. And Doug, good to have you here. Homer Ledford was an Edison. He made very nuanced kinds of changes to the dulcimer and the scales and the tuning pegs and things to improve the instrument in nuanced ways, but then he started creating hybrid instruments that borrowed parts and pieces of other instruments like the dobro or the banjo, and started creating really interesting instrument shapes as well. Warren May was pretty much a contemporary, still working. He's closed his shop and his offices in Berea, but he, under Warren May, made thousands. Really, it became quite an industry for him. And then I'm going to take a look at some of the contemporary hybrids from the 1970s to present, and leading us to the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company, where we are ending up where we began with the Uncle Ed Thomas model, that more modern way of looking at the tradition. So, next slide, please. What I find really interesting here is we've got always this balance, this tension between the conservative tradition and innovative transformation. Music itself is a matter of that. Old-time musicians, and I just came from this old-time jam where we're playing tunes the way they were played at square dances and frolics, on porches in the old way. But then there's a continuous process of changing, because musicians change. They like to take what they have and make it their own. And in the process, that old-time music became bluegrass and country and hillbilly, and it stretched itself in interesting ways. But some people chose to hew to that tradition and others to bend it more. Bluegrass took that old time music and they took the idea of jazz and improvisation and wow, came up with something brand new, and swing did the same kind of thing. Next slide, please. So those more progressive musicians in bluegrass, swing, and country embraced very much a personal style in which improvisation and freedom were more valued than adherence to older tradition. So heritage is respected as a starting point, but people felt free to change it. And what you have here in part, one of the driving factors is the audience, where you have presentation rather than preservation, where you're putting a show on for somebody. What do you have to do that? You take a fiddle tune, and I might play that at Carcassonne that Randy Wilson was talking about for 45 minutes at a time, over and over and over and over again. And if you were listening to that, you'd be bored, and you would get out of there as fast as you could. And you'd go, well, every single fiddle tune sounds exactly alike. Well, we've got titles for them so we can distinguish them. Otherwise, they're only, 2 or 3 fiddle tunes. There's one in G, one in D, and one in A. But when you play those fiddle tunes like that over and over again, it doesn't make for a great performance art. It drives a square dance, and that's what it was for. So when recordings first started happening here in the 1920s, when they first started recording this old-time music, they had to think of ways of making it entertaining. And that's why they started weaving it into skits and narratives, like the Skillet Lickers would talk about the Georgia Corn Liquor Still, and over a series of maybe 78 RPM records, they would play snatches of fiddle tunes and also tell this whole narrative story. Wait, the place is on fire. Get the cash register. To hell with the cash register. Get the fiddles. That kind of humor and everything woven into it to make it something that you could put on before people. And then you started to get people performing on stage, and to do that, they had to make a show out of it. So, presentation rather than presentation, starting to drive the music. Next slide. Well, the dulcimer is really an interesting special case of all of those instruments because it was conceived in a way and presented in a way that made it the antidote, the antithesis of the banjo and the fiddle. In a place like Hindman, Kentucky, where there were religious strictures that were in place on dancing, which is why we had play party games instead of dancing. At a place where moonshining was prevalent and there would be some violence associated with that sometimes, the antidote for that at the settlement schools was to have folks playing the dulcimer. This is an Elizabethan instrument. It harkens back to good Queen Bess and all the stereotypes we had of the mountains. This ringed parapet excluding culture where time forgot, the land that time forgot, and everybody still speaks in Elizabethan language. And when you looked at the old festival that took place in Kentucky, the American Folk Song Festival, there it was, the parade of history. It began with a few people dressed up as Native Americans, looking more like, Lakota Indians than Cherokee. And then following them, 12 buckskin-clad Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett-looking people, and each one was escorting a woman in one of those peaked hats, pointed hats with a veil and Elizabethan dresses. And so it's the parade of history, and we were Elizabethan. Daniel Boone and Queen Elizabeth coexisting in Kentucky in the mountains. And the dulcimer became the symbol for all that. So, next slide. That was David Wisnan's analysis of it that really put the dulcimer as the picturesque mountaineers and the promotion of the three-stringed dulcimer as the real or official mountain instrument. In fact, it was very rarely found. It was in some families that had preserved it and passed it on there, but there was not widespread playing of the dulcimers in the mountains really until the revival, and people like Uncle Ed Thomas are spreading it widely there. But it was that attempt to upscale the people who were living in the mountains and gentrify them through the dulcimer, rather than the rot gut music coming from the banjo. Slide. So here's the idea: tradition and transformation. And you can see where we start. That's an Uncle Ed Thomas model over on there. And then some ones that obviously look as though they'd been influenced by rock and roll and hard body, hard shell electric guitars in interesting ways. Okay, next. Where do we begin? The name comes from a translation that we get from the Bible, the scriptures. But that name dulcimer is attached to various instruments, and it was really, the hammer dulcimer, the Chinese yangqin, the santur, and the Hungarian cembalo. And all of those were an instrument that you're like a piano, almost an open piano. Then instead of keyboards, you're playing with two hammers. And we're going to look at some of those now. Slide. So here we are in the book of Daniel, and this is where we have that translation. This is where it all starts. Ye hear the sound of the cornet, flute, harp, sackbut, psaltery, dulcimer, and all kinds of music. Ye fall down and worship the golden image that Nebuchadnezzar the king hath set up. Well, that Hebrew word, symphonia, is roughly translated like sounds together. Now we can look at that today and go, oh, obviously sounds together, the dulcimer with the drones. But I think what they were really talking about, next slide, is that instrument. It's the bagpipe. That's the earliest that we're really talking about, that instrument that was like the symphonia. But I think that drone idea may be there as one of the driving forces. Next slide. Now, is there a sound on that? So this is probably our earliest dulcimer. Okay, that's enough. We can turn it off and go on to the next slide. So much of our culture traveled from the Mideast, from Persia, that area, the way the violin did. It came all the way from Kyrgyzstan probably, and the horse people, the Mongolians, and traveled on the Silk Roads, and came all the way to Italy where, Cremona is where that was happening. And likewise, this idea of the santur, the hammer dulcimer, is probably originating in the Middle East there, and we can listen to a little bit of that if you want to click on that. Okay. The Chinese yangqin, similar kind of instrument, but they use the fingers instead of the hammers. And usually people today that are playing one can play the other. They move back and forth. Hungarians. There we go. The cembalo, And I was in Budapest watching 5 or 6 cembalo players on stage that hammer dulcimer. And so we'll listen to a little bit of what that sound was like. Next slide, Mikey. I think it'll be the next slide, that's the video. That's probably enough. I thought John McCutcheon was the guy that finally figured out how to deal with that hammer dulcimer that kept the sound where you could stop it instead of everything, you know, running together all the time. But it ends up the Hungarian cembalo people figured that out long before. Kentucky hammer dulcimer, this is one that was in John Jacob Niles' collection, so I'm showing you that it was here, but it was really much more of a Scandinavian upper Midwest instrument that traveled down finally into the Shenandoah Valley and then into Kentucky. So we can look at the next slide. So the more recent history, there are all kinds of zither instruments that just are the sounding body with various numbers of strings, but this was probably that German instrument that I showed you a picture of that was referenced in the Praetorius book that traveled here. Randy Wilson, who just walked in, you know, when we pulled this thing out of the fireplace here to show it the other day, said, well, it was, you know, firewood or piece of wood or worthless, as Praetorius called it, but Randy heard a translation that was closer to outhouse talking about it. So there it is, the scheithold. But this, or the Hummel, and I think this may be where that transition is taking place in Europe at the same time, at the Hummel, where it's the scheithold, but they put it on top of a sounding body. So, next slide. Those zithers, those folk instruments, it was always a folk instrument in all kinds of shapes with different numbers of strings. So when there is no formalized pattern, as there was for an instrument like the violin, where all of the violin makers were really working with the same scale, the same shape that the Cremona classic, you know, artisans were doing, Amati and Stradivarius. The dulcimer has been wonderful because it evolved in so many different shapes. There was no authority. It was always a folk instrument. It was not part of an orchestra. It was not in a formalized setting. So people individualized it because it was a folk instrument. And craftspeople, luthiers worked to, you know, their own designs. And next slide, maybe. Well, more and better sound. That's what craftspeople want. That's what musicians want. That scheithold doesn't make much sound. Even when you put it on a table, there's just not much sound to it. So when they separated the fingerboard from the sound box, that's the critical transition, I think, that makes the scheithold or the Hummel into the dulcimer in this country. And it also took place in Europe independently. And play just a little bit of that sound if you don't see in that illustration there, we're really putting that on top of the sound box, the fingerboard that's taking place there. Next slide. Well, in some ways, the French instrument, the épinette de Vosges, is the instrument here that may be more closely related even than the scheithold to the instrument here. And one of the interesting, I'm playing a little bit of the bowed dulcimer just because that was an idea that people were working with in some ways. There were issues associated with it because you had to have a curved kind of bridge and it was problematic, but there were Tennessee music boxes, as they were called, that were bowed dulcimers, and Jacob Niles had collected one of these as well. But I wanted to play a little bit of this. This is David Schnaufer, so it's a more recent recording of one, but just so you hear what that sounded like. Are people hearing that, Mikey? I was thrilled when I found that picture, that fairly early picture of Waits in the Historical Society, that it was really clearly an épinette de Vosges shape rather than a scheithold kind of shape that was modified.
What's the difference between?
It's a different shape to the body. It was there. Well, we'd have to look at something here together. I don't have a good picture of one just by itself. John Scales, according to Ralph Lee Smith, who is one of the people that really spent time with this, in Floyd County, Virginia, 1832, there is what the shape looked like. According to Ralph Lee Smith, that's the first quote-unquote dulcimer. Jo Ellen is in the room with me here, and I think she described the first instrument she built, not knowing how to steam the wood and curve the sides, made it kind of like a old coffin case or something like that, and that's kind of the John Scales kind of way of the approach to it, I think, there. Next slide. Well, this is a very interesting find here. This is a very early dulcimer, 1817. And evidently, this is somehow, this one's related to you, isn't it? Doug? Was this the Boggs family one that came by? It was found in Kentucky.
I don't know. I don't know how they got there. No, they were, that was actually the dulcimer that belonged to, Betsy, oh gosh, Betsy Maggard. She was a Maggard.
Oh, Maggard.
She married a boy from, over in, Letcher County, Creech. So her name was
Will
Maggard Creech, and my ancestor Eli Boggs built her an instrument in the 1830s.
Okay, so this one predates it. This is really an early instrument that was, you know, at Clinton, Kentucky, kind of. I was kind of thrilled to see that. The date is 1817. You know, you can see it in the slide there. It could have been carved in later. You know, it's hard to say, but it looks pretty much like the John Scales kind of model.
I think someone just wrote that on there, but That's my opinion.
Okay.
How's that?
Next slide. So there's the way the fingerboard's finding its way onto the different body shapes, the scales, and then the Ed Thomas that is the iconic kind of hourglass shape. And next slide. Well, as I said earlier, this is really, I think, much more about culture tends to pass from family to family. There were no mass communication kinds of ways of communicating these ideas. People would, walk up a holler or travel some. Ideas traveled with them. People married into other families, and the traditions would spread, but it was really deep among certain families where this was cultivated. The Melton family of Southwest Virginia, the Pritchard family in West Virginia, and Thomas and the Amburgey family of East Kentucky were families that held on to this dulcimer making tradition. And in a community like Hindman, people were very closely related to one another. There would be, 3 or 4 extended families that the idea of the dulcimer was passing around between them. You could live really close to somebody, but it would be really hard to get to that other family because you'd have to go perhaps from the head of the holler out to the mouth of the holler and back into the next holler, and you could be just going over a mountain quickly, or you'd have to, go around the bottomland part of the holler. So these ideas tended to stay with families, and we'll take a look at some of those families now. Next slide. Nathan Hicks, the Hicks family near Beech Mountain, North Carolina, were terrific musicians and storytellers. Nathan Hicks, Rominger, made instruments for John Jacob Niles, and it was very interesting. We'll talk about how John Jacob Niles said, I want one of your dulcimers, but I play concert situations and I want it bigger. And so he expanded the size. He said, well, and that's not enough. I want more strings. So 3 strings or 4 strings that was pretty typical wasn't enough. I want 8 strings. And the next thing you know, well, I want my frets different because I want to play my way of playing accompanying music. I'm not playing melodies. I'm really playing chords. So the frets are all different. And so Nathan Hicks is starting to change the tradition, to transform it to meet the presentation rather than preservation of those ideas, the Hicks family. So next slide. And there's that one that he built, one of 3 for John Jacob Niles. Instead of just the staples, chording frets across all of the strings there. And that's at the John Jacob Niles Center at the University of Kentucky. Next slide. Well, we've talked a whole lot about Uncle Ed Thomas and the Hindman. Probably, creating the most iconic kind of instrument with the hourglass shape and the upside down heart sound holes. He thought very much like a violin maker. I think he was influenced by, that fine art of luthiery, with the overhang of the top plate, inscribing a nail along the border of the top of the instrument and the fingerboard that simulated the purfling of a violin. And he also put sound posts in his instrument like a violin. And I had one at first, and I thought, it's rattling around in there, and I assumed it was just a noter or a fretter, that somebody had accidentally, popped in there. No, it was like a violin, sound post. So Next slide. 1891, the earliest dated one. And the next slide. We've heard a lot about Uncle Ed Thomas. I hope you heard a little bit of Randy Wilson's workshop this morning, where he's talking about how that family came to be here from Cherokees in the Trail of Tears kind of situation, stopping off, the deaths in the family and whatnot, how they ended up here. But interesting history of Uncle Ed Thomas. And that's his house, Dead Mare Branch. The writer, James Still, lived in there a number of years afterwards. Beautiful log structure. The Ritchie family, Gene Ritchie's family, grew up with instruments made by Will Singleton, but before that by Uncle Ed Thomas, who influenced Will Singleton's making. And that was an instrument that Gene gave me, and you can see on the back of it the feet that were on the instrument to allow it to be played on the table so you could play it with more sound. And if you've seen Randy, playing here, he sets a board down and sets his instrument down on it, and he had little feet. So it really amplifies the sound quite a bit. Next slide. Well, there's an interesting story. I mean, there were some of them that were painted black and wondered why that was. Well, they weren't all painted black. That was a Rolling Stones song. But the real reason, according to Gene, was, he had near a whole bucket of black paint left from painting the barn, and he was going to do something with it. Maybe it was not great wood, and he painted some of them black to cover up the imperfections of the wood, but most of them were not. Next slide. Well, Randy Wilson took that picture. He hiked up a pretty big hill to take that picture of the gravesite of J.E. Thomas, Uncle Ed Thomas's grave. Any stories about that? Randy put the band, the dulcimer, up there and all.
Yeah, I do have a story about that. You want me to come
Yeah,
up?
yeah.
I can't think of the guy's name. Well, for a long time, they just had a wooden marker over that grave, Uncle Ed's grave, and it was starting to rot. And I'm trying to think of the fellow's name, but Uncle Ed used to go over the mountain from Big Doubles over the mountain toward Ison and sell his dulcimers, and he sold one to this family over there. And the youngest one of them, he listened to him, and the mother would take the youngest one up to that gravesite at Memorial Day every year, and she would take him up there, and every time she said, "This is the grave of the dulcimer maker, Ed Thomas." So, every year, and just him. He was the youngest child. She took him up there, and they would put little crepe flowers on his grave. They'd make them, she made it special, and she kind of emblazoned that in his memory where that grave was. So he worked in the mines, and there was no marker. And then this stone here is that he bought it. I think he remembered, and I think that the mother thought the youngest one may survive the longest to remember to put the marker where it is and put a marker on his grave. So she really thought ahead to a way of getting that in a person's memory to put that marker. We wouldn't have had, I don't know if we'd had a good marker up there or not if it wasn't for him, but he passed away, this fella did, so before he died, he was in the coal mines, and he placed that marker. Now, other people may have known, I don't know about, I think George Gibson knew where it was, where it is. And so, but that was an interesting story. It's a long walk up that hill, and it's the very hill where Uncle Ed, he would walk over with those dulcimers tied to his back and walk over and sell. And so he'd walk over that hill. It's a pretty steep place. So it's an interesting story that she thought in advance that well to preserve the place.
I have to say I've been after Randy to take me up there sometime if he's, charitable with my walking up that steep hill. And he said, I'll be going up there Memorial Day. And so, in some ways that tradition of Memorial Day, it's on your shoulders now, Randy. And I appreciate that you do that. So, next slide. Well, there's McKinley Craft and Will Singleton and Jethro Amburgey. He took the Thomas model and evidently 1,369 instruments, and they traveled all over the country. Right here, in this case, I've got one at the University of Kentucky as well that came to me. It was the original crate that it was shipped out to a woman in New York City who taught at Columbia College, and the newspaper was still in it, and the collect on delivery from the post office sticker, I think it was, something like, $6.92 or something. That unbelievable, the post office would deliver that and just take the money and see that it got to, Amburgey. What it was, I guess, the antecedent of the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company. It was the students at the Heinemann Settlement School that are like Santa's little workshop, and all the elves are learning how to make woodworking skills by making these instruments, and they traveled all over the world. $35 in 1963, and it's a pretty good price. Next slide. Well, there's Uncle Will Singleton, and he was, as I mentioned, kin to Jean Ritchie. This is what she said about him. In Viper, where we live, the dulcimer maker was Will Singleton, whose old-fashioned white frame house sat just over the river from the post office at the other end of the swinging bridge. Uncle Will had a large, kindly face and framed by a shock of silky white hair and a tremendous mustache to match. It's not in that photograph. I looked far and wide to find that photograph. That was actually the best version of it is in Alan Eaton's Handicrafts of the Southern Appalachians, but that would have been a Doris Ullman photograph originally, the original of that. People said that Will Singleton didn't make very good dulcimers. They were crudely done. And I have to tell you, this one that is also pictured in the Handicrafts of the Southern Appalachians is very well made. He's got this little inlay on it of diamonds and hearts. And the only thing that's particularly odd about this one is John Jacob Niles refretted it for his own playing style, so that's not the original. But you can see where the frets were on this instrument. And that's also at the Niles Gallery at UK. Next slide. Well, here we go, McKinley Craft. McKinley Craft learned how to make his dulcimers from Ed Thomas in 1917. And then the story, Joel and I've talked about the McSpaddens, but the connection was through McKinley Craft to Missouri and how that came to be. Craft learned to build dulcimers there, but the dulcimer was owned by Joe Craft, McKinley's cousin. And McKinley visited Joe in 1923 or so, and he was a bootlegger at the time, which is hard to believe, I know. And McKinley traded him a dulcimer for a jar of whiskey. interesting interview there. Okay, next slide. And there's one of his instruments. Next slide. There's Jethro Amburgey. This again is a Doris Ullman photograph. She and John Jacob Niles came and did a lot of photographs at the same time. And there he is at the wood shop. The wood shop's no longer there. It's been torn down. Next slide. And next slide. And there's the shipping case at the one I have at the Niles Center. But the one here looks almost the same.
It's got the same label on it there.
Yeah. Did you have the newspaper in yours?
The lid is off, it's laying right behind it.
Pardon?
The lid is off of it. It's
Yeah,
laying
yeah. But did you have newspaper wrapping in yours still?
I have all the booklets and things that came with it.
Oh, okay.
His instruction book
Uh-huh.
and the letter explaining how to use it.
How to use it, how to play it. Okay, next one, next slide. Yeah, I could date it because I knew exactly what the newspaper dates were, and you know, you could still read the funny paper in one of the sheets in there. Next slide. Well, one of the things that Don Petty set out to do was play the instruments at the places where the instruments were made, which is a project he's still engaged in, and did some at Ed Thomas's cabin, George Gibson's place, and here's Don Petty playing an Amburgey dulcimer at the Hyman Settlement School right here. A number of years ago. That's Don's hand. It's really important to remember that place and people and musical instruments and music are all bound together in a very, very important and tight way. Yeah, Randy?
I don't know if you talked about this yet, that instrument. You got Shiloh's, Epinet, Hummel.
Yeah.
Then where did, along the line, did it start to be called a dulcimer?
Well, at the beginning, I took some time to talk about it. It was like a translation in the Bible from the book of Daniel,
Yes,
but they were really referring to the bagpipe probably. But it was the Hebrew word was really translated as a sympathy or sounding together, and you know, maybe that's where the bagpipe or the dulcimer with the drones meant sounding together. So that's where that name, now I don't know where it first was attached to that instrument. That's a good question, and I've not, have any of you heard that yet? Lee Smith, I mean, you know, Ralph Lee Smith never ventured it, and you know, we know where that name and the association are coming from all the way back to the Bible and the misunderstanding of it. But where it really happened.
Yeah, why was this instrument called that, at the same name as the hammer dulcimer? That was.
Yeah, and the
That's
hammer
the
dulcimer,
question.
same thing, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
There's
So, I mean,
no look alike at all, or structurally at all.
Yeah,
It just don't make any sense.
No.
No. Other than, you know, you have to figure, well, this is a sweet sounding instrument, it's a soft instrument and dulcet, you know, made sense. But I don't know who first did it.
Mère is the C in French, so it's like one translation is the sweet C. Another, you know,
I
is
thought Omer was a Latin or Greek word for sound.
It could be, but MER in French
Yeah.
is a C.
That's true.
It probably
So
came
it's
from
also
the
there.
Latin translation of the Bible, and it just was transliterated, it was just.
Well, it was Hebrew originally, yeah.
Brought
and then
whole
the-
cloth from the Vulgate, I guess, or whatever they called that Latin version, and probably the word just came over with the scripture, and somebody probably applied it from the Bible and said, well, there's what a dulcimer is.
Yeah,
I mean, it seems likely, since there's a lot of Bibles around back then.
and that's a good point. It could have happened to, it's like the old ballads where they would add a verse at the end that would mention the church or salvation, so that those ballads could be sung in certain, Christian,
Mhm.
denominations.
The word actually appears in the King James, which was, what, 1622? So, the word was out there.
Oh,
Yeah.
I see. Well, in the Bible, then Nebuchadnezzar calls for the sound of the cymbals and the dulcimer.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard to imagine a dulcimer competing with the cymbals, so it had to be some
Yeah.
kind of.
Well,
I think
that's,
the bagpipes would be
that's why it was the bagpipes. That's what they were thinking. It meant, the Hebrew word meant sounding together. I put that passage up and everything
Oh.
earlier
Just
in the
glad
talk, but you're
I'm
absolutely
sorry.
right. No, you're absolutely right. And it's how we get back to that same idea again of, well, here's the idea of dulcimer as a mistranslation or whatever of the instrument, but then how do we first really call that zither that's developing here a dulcimer, and also the hammer dulcimer instead of the cembalo or the
Just be
Yeah.
glad they didn't call it Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah.
if Randy were in charge, it would have been the wham doodle,
Well,
the firstborn of the wham.
Oh, the wang doodle.
Well, Jean Ritchie, we've talked about over the past few days here over and over again, but she brought that dulcimer to New York City, and where she was discovered by Alan Lomax and performed at Columbia University in 1948. As a result, the dulcimer got some visibility in New York City amongst the folk, what would be the folk revivalists, Woody Guthrie, and the dulcimer started to travel, particularly from Heinemann Settlement Schools. People saw her and, oh, you're from Kentucky. Oh, this is where it is. And at this point, it really becomes known as the Kentucky dulcimer rather than the hammer dulcimer. Later, people, well, they were Virginia and West Virginia and Tennessee dulcimers, so, oh, maybe the lap dulcimer or the Appalachian dulcimer to characterize it. So, qualification there. I think people have heard enough Jean Ritchie, here. We don't need to listen to that sound clip. There, picture I took of Jean at the Family Folk Week at Heinemann, just to put her in place. This is a very important place to her. Her rocking chair is right over there in the corner. You can't see it in the camera, but she would preside over morning singing here and sitting in that rocking chair many a morning. And she was terribly important to the settlement school. Next slide. Well, John Jacob Niles and Jethro Amburgey, there they are posed together when Niles was traveling in the 1920s and 1930s and connected with Doris Ullman, who was taking photographs, and he was collecting music. And he was a very interesting collector because he was not trying to preserve anything like later collectors like Lomax's, who were recording it. What he was doing was documenting it in notebooks by hand, transcribing it. And he was trying to really create a repertoire for himself where he learned this music and he would perform it. And he wrote down the things that he heard, but also that he wanted to hear. And you can do that when you're transcribing by hand, but you can't do that if you're Alan Lomax pushing a button on a recording device. So there's a very interesting difference to the way he collected and why he collected. But he, in part, is really keeping some of these interesting and obscure versions of things alive in his own particular way. Next slide. John Jacob Niles was performing widely following World War I when he was a flyer, came back and lived in New York City and traveled to Europe several times with Marion Kirby, who was she would do like almost minstrel show, plantation sketches, narratives, and they would sing together duets. And Niles would play piano and do arrangements, and he started, in addition to doing the African American material, Niles introduced the Appalachian material, but he was playing it on the piano and accompanying himself. And later he decided, only vaudeville performers played piano and sang at the same time. So he needed something else, and the dulcimer was the answer. It became a prop for him to act out his dramas, like the hangman. He would caress it and show her being hung, or Pretty Polly, and he would take out that pocket knife and stab at her. The blood flowed. So that instrument was, again, tradition and transformation, the presentation and preservation. I like linking those P words because it became presentation for Niles, who studied opera. So drama was absolutely important to him. And that dulcimer spread widely because John Jacob Niles was very, very widely known through his recordings. The earliest RCA 78s with John Jacob Niles, Mountaineer Tenor, as the label called him. It's on the Red Seal label, not their popular labels. It was the Red Seal label with Caruso and all the great classical artists. So that's how it spread that way. Next slide. And there he is with Marion Kirby. We've already talked about, but now you get a chance to see him a little bit. They hated each other. And I mean, he would have, put a knife in her back if he could have. But they were so successful for so long that they stayed together for a number of years.
Why did he hate her?
It's a long story. They were probably both prima donnas, and he was her accompanist, and there was probably some antagonism, and she just infuriated him. Read the book. I'm going to send you one, Joe Ellen. Yeah. Next slide. And there they are towards the end of their time together. And at this time, he's not making his own dulcimers. He's just using Jethro Amburgey ones that he saw at Heinemann with Amburgey. Next slide. And this is, he had his hands on the dulcimer as a kid outside of Louisville. And it was a crude instrument, but he had some exposure to it as just a youth. But, and this is in the, probably the late 1890s, early 1900. But he traveled to Viper and spent time with Ballas and Abigail Ritchie. I got Jean to talk about this one time with me, and she said, Johnny Niles stood around, helped Miss Doris set up things, and twiddled with Dad's dulcimer, looking it over, tapping it here and there, and trying to make tunes on it. So this is a Doris Ullman photograph of Ballas and John Jacob Niles together at their house. Viper. Next slide. The Jean Thomas, the Trapeson woman, created this, wrote a number of books and created a festival near Ashland that went, at one time there were thousands of people at this folk festival. She created the persona of Jilson Setters, who is really Bill Day, a blonde needle salesman or peddler, or would hang out at the courthouse, and she heard him, and she had worked as a script girl for Cecil B. DeMille on the original Ten Commandments. And so she was, had firsthand knowledge in California of theatrical, how to deal with, building drama up from Cecil B. DeMille. So she took this, blonde fiddler and made him into something else, posed him in a ladder-back chair every time with an egg basket at his feet, took him to England as the minstrel of the mountains, and Jilson Setters, and wrote books about him and romanticized it. So she was the one that had this pageant that I described with the buckskin-clad, Daniel Boone's escorting the Elizabethan women. Jean Thomas, and there is John Jacob Niles, and they conspired in entrepreneurial ways. They had some antagonism, but they also knew how to use one another to present rather than preserve the music, although they did serve that function of preserving it in some ways too, but they transformed it. Next slide. And those were some instruments that Niles had collected, the traditional dulcimers. And next slide. So there he is, posed with one of the instruments that he created himself, looking very Carl Sandburg-ish in a way, that noble pose off into the distance. And he was a good-looking man, and but that's very much kind of like an Elizabethan lute, style of instruments. So here's where we have the Nilesimer instead of the dulcimer. So they're really hybrid instruments. Next slide. So some of the instruments that Niles created. That was one that I found in an attic, kind of tucked away in his home that people didn't really know was there. A big instrument that may never have worked at all. I don't know if it really played. Next slide. And I wanted to show you that, even though Niles is creating innovative shapes, that other people were doing this independently. There is a Bavarian instrument I found that looked rather similar in some ways, as you can tell. Niles hadn't seen that, but they're playing with the idea of taking traditional instrument shapes and creating new forms for them. And that's, as my friend Don Petty would say, they were all zithers, really, in a way. They're just looking at different sound bodies and how do you create different shapes for them, for those stringed instruments. And, they were lutes or mandolins or instruments of that shape. Another slide. And there he is at his farm working on an instrument. That was actually posed. I believe that was a National Geographic article on John Jacob Niles. Next slide. Well, there's a diagram of that cello-like instrument that he created from parts of a cello that he's carving and working on. He's learning some woodworking skills. It was in his family, and he had done a lot of wood crafting himself, but Harry Mefford, who was the head of building and grounds at the University of Kentucky, allowed him to use his wood shop and all of his tools. And he's learning, something about bracing and everything, I think, from Harry Mefford. So these instruments were actually very well made, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Next slide. Just showing a stage of progress being made on the instrument. Next slide. And there's that dulcimer, which changed. He did things to it over the years as well. And one more slide. What the headstock looked like. 8 strings. Next slide. So here he is at Newport. I thought it'd be good to listen to a little bit of John Jacob Niles' peculiar, unique voice, doing a little bit of the hangman as he enacts that hangman story with the dulcimer itself.
Line, slack it just a while, for I think I see my papa coming, traveling many a mile, traveling many a mile. Papa, Papa, has you brought gold for to pay this hangman's fee, or did you come to see me swinging high from this hangman's tree, high from this hangman's tree? Daughter, 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 I brought no gold for to pay this hangman's fee, but I come to see
running
you
for
swinging,
shelter in their house,
high from this
tornado shelters,
hangman's.
whatever. Yeah. Let's go on to the next slide. That moment, though, Jean Ritchie told me about that moment there, and she said it was really spectacular. It was, fog was rolling in off the water, and the mist was, there, and Niles appears and does this hangman as the fog is in there, and it was just, a remarkably dramatic presentation, as you can imagine. Was it a folk presentation? That Niles, as a folk musician, is, you can certainly debate that. It's a thin line between not at all and a little bit, but anyway. Homer Ledford, Clark County neighbor of John Jacob Niles. Both of them live in Clark County, although Homer was originally from Tennessee near the Kentucky border. Doug Naselrode talked about that early instrument he made, a matchstick fiddle out of a dynamite box. Homer talked to me about it, but he didn't have it any longer, and I'd love to have seen what it looked like. Homer Ledford. Next slide. And he repaired some instruments at the John C. Campbell School in North Carolina, Brasstown, where he went there, and that was where he first came into contact with the dulcimer. So here, the intersection of all of these people at the John C. Campbell Folk School, Edna Ritchie, various Ritchie family members. May was actually in North Carolina. John Jacob Niles was going to buy property there, and were good friends with May Deschamps, who was a Ritchie, and so they were all intersecting. So the influences passing around of the dulcimers and the ballad materials are all going in between North Carolina and Kentucky here with the Ritchie family, and then Niles had been there working with Doris Ullman. So it's a really interesting entangled history. Niles spent quite a bit of time at Brasstown, North Carolina. I went and talked to Mercer Scroggs, who was a fairly old man, but he was a boy when John Jacob Niles went, and Mercer and his brother would take them up the dry creek beds to a place where there was music. And I expected him to say, kind of derogatory things about Niles, but he said, "Oh, he was like a Santa Claus. Everybody loved him. That's how the pint bottle came to this area." I went, "Pint bottle, Mercer? What are you talking about?" "Well, everybody was moonshining. It wasn't a matter of who made the whiskey. It was who made it that day or who had the best." And he said, "Now, John Jacob Niles knew every bootlegger around, but Miss Ullman didn't approve of it. So John Jacob Niles, to get people to sing with him as he was collecting music, why, he put in little pint bottles and had them hidden all over him. So Miss Ullman would go up there and treat people's wounds or heal them with some salve or, tend to physical kind of things. And Johnny would be, giving them a little bit of the pint bottle, and he'd sing a song and get them to sing a song. And the next thing he knew, John Jacob Niles was collecting there and was going to live there. Had bought 35 acres, but moved to Kentucky instead. So enough of Johnny Niles there in North Carolina. But it's interesting to see how between North Carolina and Kentucky, the Ritchie family brought a lot of the material back and forth from those places. Next slide. And there's Homer. He worked with that Amburgey pattern again, but he made the scale more perfect and figured out ways of making the instrument better that were very nuanced kinds of changes, and what was really the Uncle Ed Thomas model as the beginning part of it. But Homer kept working with that. And next slide. So it becomes, really the Homer Ledford dulcimer rather than the Jethro Amburgey. But if you look at casually, you wouldn't notice the difference. I mean, you really have to pay attention to it. And Doug could tell you exactly what had changed in the instrument at this point. But I have to say, some of Homer's instruments, the intonation was not very good at first, the scale he was using, and he perfected that and got that really perfect. Next slide. Just to show you, what that evolution was. Next slide. Well, this was an interesting story that I saw Don nodding, and really the 4-string dulcimer has pretty much become the standard, or at least people cut grooves in the finger, at the top of the nut, so you can have different options. Gene was playing a lot at festival outside, and Edna was as well, and they wanted more sound in their instrument. It got lost in an outdoor kind of larger crowd setting, and so thought, well, we'll put an extra string. What Homer did was put a middle string, another drone string in, but what people eventually did was double the melody string, the string closest to your tummy when you're playing, rather than that middle string. So it was really Homer that's responsible for that 4-string dulcimer, but for Floyd, he did the middle strings instead of that melody string. Next slide. And there it is, he's stretching the tradition with transformation in progressive ways. In the same way that Jean Ritchie is writing her own songs based on traditional songs, you hear, how much her songs that she wrote are modeled on the traditional models, but she uses a pseudonym, Than Hall, and starts to create songs where there were not songs about some situation that it had existed in the past, particularly here coal mining kinds of songs. Homer maintained that traditional form, but he also used his imagination and created some wonderful shapes. Joellen, you'd probably love to have seen this one in the flesh. It's a beautiful instrument and fine inlay and everything on it. Next slide. And he created these hybrid instruments. That's a dulcimer. That's a very young, his daughter Cindy, playing that shaped instrument. Next slide. They're dulcimers not because of the shape of the instrument, but because of the fingerboard, the fretting of it. They're still diatonic rather than chromatic. Homer Ledford created several courting dulcimers or sweetheart dulcimers, and that's one he built for me. And there he is in his shop, and if you come to Troublesome Creek, the Forks of Troublesome Creek to Hindman, you can see what that studio looked like. Doug recreated that shade of green that was so beautiful. I have to say that shop behind his house was amazing. Every inch of the space was used. He'd pull a sanding belt down from above or a saw from the ceiling. I mean, it was a crazy place. The museum in Winchester, now they call it the History Museum, I believe, has a room that is also dedicated to Homer Ledford. That they've replicated the shop in some ways, and they even have sawdust on the floor. It's a nice touch. So Homer Ledford at home. Next slide. And there he is. And one of the things that made Homer special was he played music as well and played his own instruments. And we talked about this on Joellen. What makes her instruments so special and so good is she's a musician herself, and what she's hearing is what she wants in her instruments. So maybe listen to just a little bit of Homer Ledford. And he's playing all these instruments on this recording. Warren May, and I'm going to go pretty lightly over these people now. I'm going to skip over them, but at least so you can see who they were and what their instruments looked like. Warren May, working in Berea, and as I said, just closed his shop just a few years ago. Absolutely wonderful cabinet maker. I mean, made beautiful furniture. This is going to be my personal opinion. A lot of his instruments I didn't care for the sound of them, but they were gorgeous. And then some of them that he took personal interest in and cared about were beautiful. They sounded good, but he had a lot of people working for him that he kind of supervised because he was putting out a lot of instruments at Berea. So that's Warren May. And some of his sound holes were really the iconic part of it. 15,000 instruments, and that wasn't the end of it. That was amazing. He took wood that had interesting knot holes in it and created the sound holes around those knots that were amazing. The hummingbird was really the one that you see the most. That shape of the fusion of the hourglass and teardrop was his doing. And a little bit of what the fingerboard looked like that you can see there. And next slide. Well, here we are, Troublesome Creek. This was a picture at the luthiers. We got to visit there today. That was Mike Sloan, who was involved in making instruments here from the beginning, and really he wanted to see this dulcimer homecoming take place more than anybody, so I'm glad to have him pictured there, and a very important person in this community, Mike Sloan. Next slide. There's the logo of the Troublesome Creek String Instrument Company. That's a picture I took. You gave me that sticker many a year ago now. Picture of Doug at the factory itself that I took on a visit last year or so. Oh, Joellen! And here she is. Well, here's what I said about her. And it ends up being pretty true. You can argue with me about it, but beautiful, beautiful instruments that you've seen in the workshops and in concert here. And interesting, I heard the Indian rhythms, the other night came across so clearly. And your workshop, you were talking about how you went out of different meters and working threes against twos and things. So, very important part of her work. But again, one of, like Homer Ledford, a musician that's also a craftsperson, and how the two are a wonderful fusion.
Are you aware that the one on the right, I'm holding two dulcimers. The one on the right, a good friend of mine still has, it's number 4. And the sides are not bent. That's cut out of a solid piece of walnut. And the one on the left was 2010.
Uh-huh.
So it's just number 4 and number 40,
Yeah, and that's the sitting dog
Yeah.
model or shape, yeah. Good, good. Next slide. Next slide. Is there another? Oh yeah, I was showing the tradition and transformation. There are some Joellen's instruments from a poster that she has. Next. Some interesting, this is kind of reminds me of the Ovation guitars a little bit, where they fuse different materials. The design here, HX Design, Michigan, and quite a bit of sound out of those instruments. Next slide. Have any of you ever played one of his? I've just heard a recording. I mean, the sound is very big, as you might expect, like an Ovation guitar, with the polymer or plastic kind of resonating part of it. Next slide. Now, inevitably, electricity plays a role in this. Whether you amp, the dulcimer is at such a disadvantage with other instruments because it is such a sweet sound and soft, and it gets covered easily by louder string instruments, much less a whole band. And so ways of electrifying it. Next slide.
Hello everybody, this is Quentin Stevens, and I thought I'd do a little quick video here.
There it is.
The race car dulcimer that I made and finished up
Is there
last
sound
week.
that you can hear? Or?
I put a video out there on Facebook showing it, but since I didn't have any video of it actually moving, then everybody I got a lot of comments about wanting to see it move and wanting to see it run, and actually got a couple of comments that blatantly called it a fake. And so I thought, well, okay, I need to make a video here of it actually running. So here's the race car dulcimer. And you can see that the wheels are boogieing,
That's the weirdest thing.
and the steering truck works.
No,
What I did was I took
No, you can play
a
it by
grave
hand,
digger
but you
remote
can,
control
yes,
truck,
zoom it around
and
the room.
I cut it apart with my
remote
bandsaw
control.
and took the steering section and the drivetrain section and mounted them here in the dulcimer, and did some rewiring because I had to extend the wires so that they would actually reach the battery pack, which I also cut out of the truck and installed. So this thing works just fine. Here's my remote control to it.
Ooh. Like
And at the same
really
time,
straight, like electric
Not only is it
guitar.
remote control,
It's just like plywood, basically.
but it is a working electric dulcimer. lost my pick. I'm going to use the piece of
Next slide. Yeah, fuzz box.
I mean, I knew him when he was really young.
Well,
And Bing, I think there's another one, yeah.
Bing Futch, you know, another one of these people that's really pushing the repertoire and everything,
Yeah.
playing electric. Maybe next slide.
Can't have him come down next year, though.
Just a little bit of this raga piece, if we can listen to it, that I enjoy. And one of the things that people have done is, you know, stands for these things instead of putting them on your lap or on the table. I mean, it's become, you know, pretty standard. Mackie, that's probably enough of that for people to hear. The way of playing these things, I mean, basically oh, bass playing. So that's where we've come. We're back at the beginning here at the Hindman Settlement School. We're at the hearth of the dulcimer, the iconic kind of traditional dulcimer, and watched as people transform tradition in their ways to present it rather than preserve it, and allow individuals to allow this folk instrument that was not shaped by orchestral formality or you know, perfection of, you know, we've already reached the perfect you know, way that the trumpet, the length of it, the, you know, the shape of it, all of those things. People aren't going to make, you know, variants on those things very much, but with the dulcimer, it's lent itself to individual expression in making and in performance of music. And people have made, those people who value tradition have adhered to older ways of doing it, and those who have valued the presentation and originality and improvisation and spontaneity and freedom have embraced the other ways of negotiating that. And so I think one of the beauties of being here for the Dulcimer Homecoming is we've brought it all home here, but we've showed that there's a great diversity of the instrument and the way people think about it and play it and make it today. So that's where I'm going to end up unless you all have comments.
I have a question. You mentioned McSpadden,
Mhm.
but where in this evolution, who did McSpadden learn from?
McSpadden, I did talk about that. It came from McKinley Craft, whose brother, you know, traveled to Missouri, and, you know, evidently the pattern made it into McSpadden's from, you know, McKinley Craft. Was it cousin or brother? Cousin, I think.
His cousin.
Yeah, his cousin, yeah.
They grew up in Batesville.
Yeah. So that's where the idea, and I didn't focus much on McSpadden, although they're, you know, huge dulcimer, you know, trained Ozark tradition, but I tried to focus this more on Kentucky, you know, but
Yeah, I
I guess,
bet.
There's also, you know, I don't know how they, when they went more west, there's those Missouri dulcimers. Have you seen those walking cane dulcimers?
yeah, yeah.
You need to throw in a mention about Bristol Taylor, who lived right there with Jethro Amburgey and Uncle Ed Thomas out there at Big Doubles. He was a near neighbor, and he made beautiful dulcimers. We actually have one of them from 1905. And people think of him as a Berea dulcimer maker, but he was one of that group out there at Big Doubles. So and he was an excellent craftsman. We have one made of oak that's just a beautiful instrument. You need to play it sometime.
Yeah, can you show me
Yeah.
sometime? I know next to nothing about it.
I'll show you right now.
All right.
I think it's right here, if I'm not mistaken.
That big, big,
It's one of these. Well,
is it that big one?
oh, here it is. You've been sitting right in front of it. That's Bristol Taylor from 1905.
Can you hold it up there? And,
Oh, yeah.
yeah.
We're on camera? This way. No, this, that's what works.
Everything goes backwards here. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so this is made of white oak, but in almost every detail, this is a Thomas dulcimer made by his neighbor, Bristol Taylor. And it's dated in here, it says 1905. Wonderful donation to our museum, but we haven't dove too deep into it. But look at how beautifully articulated these heart-shaped samples are. He got it. He knew how to make these. And Don, you need to take a spell and play this.
Is it tuned or?
No, but tune it up sometime and play
Okay,
it.
let's do it. I'd love to.
Okay, there. That's my interruption.
That's a good interruption. Yeah, that's somebody I need to learn about from you.
Well, he's got an epic poem too. Bristol Taylor does.
I've read that.
Okay.
I have. Yeah. Well, Mikey, are there any questions for anybody who might have lingered long over there?
Somebody asked, any thoughts on ID Stanford?
Oh, yeah. Here's in Letcher County, just right over.
Yeah, you know, remarkable musician and maker. ID, what the most striking thing for me is he was one of those people that used the noter, the fretter, almost exclusively, and it was perfect. It was always right on the note. If you see a film called Sourwood Mountain Dulcimer that John McCutcheon made with him,
That's great.
it's a great documentary of ID, and he was a great musician. I'm sorry I didn't mention him, you know, because he's he was influential, not part of any school or anything, you know, I mean, he wasn't tied to other players necessarily, was he? But just everybody, you know, I mean, you came to see him because he was great.
Yeah, he was, and, I mean, he was the influence for me to get a bass dulcimer. His dulcimer was so big that's what it's, yeah. I mean, usually people play those bass dulcimers like, you know, but I mean, to me, it's just makes it sound like an ID. Stanford, it's beautiful.
Yeah.
One more question from Carly Dawn. Was it because of Niles' classical interests and training the reason that you don't consider him a folk musician?
Carly Dawn, it's good. I love you dearly. It's a really complicated issue. When I started at the University of Kentucky, and I asked the folklorist on the faculty if he would be on my graduate committee, and he said, "Why, sure, surely I'd be happy to." And I said, "And I'm fixing to write a dissertation on Jacob Niles." And he said, Niles, he was a fraud. He was not a folk musician by any stretch of the imagination. He was a phony and a fraud. And I thought, oh hell, I'm never going to get my doctorate here, you know, if I've got this. But that was the inspiration for me to try and figure out what he was if he wasn't a folk musician. He was a musician who played folk material, but he brought and he was also a folk musician growing up. He learned ballads and you know, some dulcimer and things from his mama. He learned to transcribe and collect music from his mom, so he knew, you know, and he was collecting from people in the community, so he heard it, he understood it. His dad taught him a lot of that. His dad was a square dance caller, so he was familiar with all of that and grew up with it, but he also learned to read music and play piano by notation, and he eventually went to study opera, sang in the lyric opera in Chicago, you know, as a training course after World War I, and he was a composer, so he's composing music, but he married the composition with the traditional music and created these artful pieces in the style of folk music that were part him and part tradition. But there were things that he did that were entirely, I would call, folk music. His ballad book, you know, he didn't tamper with those ballads. You know, he set them down pretty much the way they were. He might have performed them in a much more theatrical way than you know, Nimrod Workman or something that would just give you the straight story and let the story tell itself. Niles felt, because of that operatic and dramatic training, that he needed to you know, make the story come alive for you. So Carly Dawn, I would say, in some ways he was a folk musician, and in other ways he was a musician who
He was more than a folk musician.
used folk music.
He was more than just a folk musician.
More than just a folk musician, yeah. And the word folk, you know, has been so abused, and you know, I mean, now it's just the term doesn't mean anything more than, oh, you play acoustic music, you're a singer-songwriter, you know, that's folk music. Bob Dylan, you know, started kind of that, oh, they're folk musicians. But the real folk musicians are the people that were recorded, you know, in a field, you know, going, you know, and that kind of stuff where people, oh my God, you know, and that's why, you know, Niles, Mountaineer tenor, you know, on the gold Red Seal label, you know, he may have been, you know, promoted as a folk musician, but he was clearly being marketed as an art musician and popular musician. Carly Dawn, it's a really good question. I would say, if you wanted really to get a more articulate response to that, read that book that I wrote on John Jacob Niles, I Wonder as I Wander. I'm not trying to sell the book, but it really talks about that.
It's a good book. I mean, I read it, and I wasn't real interested in John Jacob Niles until I started reading it. kept me.
It's a page turner.
It's a page turner, that was it.
Does that get all the questions out of there, Mikey?
Yep.
That was a good one.
Good. Well, thank you all very much, whoever, you know, managed to survive all this time at the workshop, and thank you all for being here and making interesting questions and contributing to it. Thank you.